The Night in the Abandoned House, Jack's Terrifying Escape. This chilling story, retold in a hauntingly vivid way, revolves around the eerie experiences of a man named Jack. He returns to his ancestral village after many years, hoping to surprise his elderly grandparents, but instead he stumbles upon an unsettling and terrifying night in an abandoned house that once belonged to an old woman named Mrs. Thorne. What begins as a simple journey home quickly spirals into a nightmare as Jack is confronted with unsettling events, strange apparitions, and an inexplicable feeling of dread that only deepens as the night progresses. The house, long rumored to be haunted, proves to hold more than just whispers of the past. It harbors vengeful spirits that are all too real. Jack, drained from exhaustion, illness, and fear, falls into a terrifying dreamlike state, blurring the line between nightmare and reality. His senses, dulled by fever, betray him, leaving him vulnerable to the horrors lurking in the shadows. The story culminates in a harrowing encounter with the malevolent spirits tied to the tragic history of the house. In this retelling, emotional tension builds steadily, and the line between the supernatural and the psychological terror is masterfully blurred. Jack's fear is palpable as he battles his own mind, the dark forces surrounding him, and a past he cannot understand. Part 1. Return to the village. The city had always been Jack's home, a bustling landscape of noise and lights, a comforting chaos that drowned out any sense of isolation. But tonight, as he stepped off the rickety bus into the darkened village of his childhood, he felt something far more unsettling than the urban noise he was used to. The air was thick, heavy with a stillness that made his skin crawl. The village lay in front of him, draped in a mist that clung to the narrow, winding roads like some ancient shroud. It was far from the vibrant, lively place he remembered. No children playing, no elders gathered by the roadside, not a single flicker of light from any of the houses. The scene was as if the village had been frozen in time, abandoned by life itself. Jack paused, a shiver running down his spine. He shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that had begun to gnaw at him. It was just a cold, he told himself. It had been years since he'd returned here, after all. Things were bound to change. The plan had been simple: take a surprise trip to visit his grandparents, whom he hadn't seen in years. They lived alone now in this sleepy, forgotten corner of the world, and Jack thought it would be a pleasant surprise to show up unannounced. He hadn't told them about his visit, wanting to make it special. But now, as he looked around, that plan seemed far less comforting than it had when he left the city. The bus driver had dropped him off at the edge of the village before driving away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Jack stood there for a moment, utterly alone in the stillness. There wasn't even the sound of animals, no dogs barking, no crickets chirping. Just silence, oppressive and thick, as though the entire place was holding its breath. Jack fumbled for his phone, hoping to at least check the time or call his grandparents. But the screen remained black, his phone battery drained to zero, probably from the hours he'd spent aimlessly scrolling during the ride. Of course, he muttered under his breath, pocketing the useless device. He glanced up at the sky, which was quickly darkening. A storm was clearly on the way. Thick clouds were gathering, swallowing the last traces of twilight, and he had no intention of getting caught in the rain. With a deep breath, Jack adjusted his backpack and began walking down the familiar, yet unsettlingly different path towards his grandparents' house. His shoes squelched against the damp earth as the first fat drops of rain splattered onto the cracked pavement. The wind began to pick up, tugging at his clothes and whispering through the skeletal branches of trees that lined the road. Jack pulled his jacket tighter, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in his stomach. It had been years since his last visit, but the path was etched in his memory. Each bend in the road, each crumbling fence post, and each looming tree triggered flashes of distant memories of summer days spent playing in the fields, chasing after his grandfather's dog, or helping his grandmother pick vegetables from the garden. But now, those memories felt distant and strange, like they belonged to someone else. The village, once so full of life, now felt like a hollow shell, as though whatever had once been there had withered away long ago. The rain began to fall harder, a relentless downpour that quickly soaked through Jack's clothes. He cursed under his breath as the wind drove the rain into his face, making it difficult to see. The road, already muddy, became slick, and Jack struggled to keep his footing as he hurried along. He was almost there, just a little further, and he'd be safe inside, sitting by the fire with his grandparents, sharing stories and catching up on lost time. But when he finally turned the corner and saw the house, his heart sank. The familiar structure stood there, but it wasn't as he remembered it. The house was dark, no welcoming light shining from the windows, no warm glow from the kitchen that should have been beckoning him inside. Instead, it looked empty, abandoned. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. The house looked as though no one had lived there for years. The garden, once meticulously cared for by his grandmother, was overgrown with weeds, wild and untamed. Well, the windows were covered in dust and grime, and the front gate, which used to hang slightly ajar, was now chained shut. What the hell, Jack muttered, his pulse quickening. He stepped closer, squinting through the rain. Surely there had to be some explanation. Maybe his grandparents had gone away for the weekend. But why would they leave the house looking like this? And why hadn't they told him? Jack reached the gate, the metal cold and slick under his hands. The chain clinked softly as he rattled it, testing the lock. Solid. No way in. He backed away, trying to make sense of the situation. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. His grandparents were supposed to be here, waiting for him, not ... He glanced up at the windows again, half expecting to see his grandmother's face peeking out from behind the curtains, but there was nothing. Just the rain pounding against the glass, turning the house into a shadowy silhouette. A chill ran down Jack's spine, and it wasn't from the cold. Something about the house, about the whole village felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the longer he stood there, the more his unease grew. The silence, the stillness, it felt oppressive, as though the very air was waiting for something. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. He needed to get inside, needed to find some clue as to what was going on. But the locked gate, the absence of any signs of life, it all made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something far darker than he had anticipated. He was about to turn away when a movement caught his eye, a flash of something in the upstairs window. He froze, squinting through the rain. Had he just seen someone up there? It had been so quick, so subtle, that he wasn't sure if his mind was playing tricks on him. But he could have sworn he saw the faint outline of a figure standing just behind the curtain. "Grandma?" Grandpa Jack called out, his voice shaky, barely louder than a whisper. No answer. He felt foolish for even trying. The figure, if there had been one, was gone. Feeling a growing sense of urgency, Jack made his way around the side of the house, looking for another way in. His shoes slipped in the mud as he trudged through the overgrown weeds, the rain soaking him to the bone. Every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to hold him back. As he rounded the corner to the back of the house, his heart leapt. The back door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Relief washed over him. Maybe they were home after all. Maybe they had just been asleep or out running an errand. He hurried forward, pushing the door open. Inside, the house was dark. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The familiar warmth of his grandparents' home was gone, replaced by an oppressive chill that seemed to seep into his bones. "Grandma?" Grandpa, he called out again, stepping inside. His voice echoed through the empty house, but no one answered. Jack's heart raced as he ventured further in. The living room was exactly as he remembered it, yet it felt lifeless, untouched for far too long. The fireplace, once the heart of the home, was cold and dark. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in a fine layer of dust, as though no one had sat there in years. A sickening feeling began to build in Jack's stomach. This wasn't right. Where were they? Why was the house in this state? His thoughts raced, panic starting to claw at the edges of his mind. Something had happened here, something he didn't understand. He moved towards the stairs, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Each creak of the wooden steps sent a jolt of anxiety through him, but he forced himself to keep going. If they weren't downstairs, maybe they were in their room, sleeping, unaware of his arrival. But as he reached the top of the stairs, the uneasy feeling intensified. The hallway stretched out in front of him, dark and silent, the doors to the bedrooms all closed. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never felt this way in his grandparents' house before. This place, which had once been his heaven, now felt like a stranger. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob of his grandparents' bedroom. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his ears before slowly turning the handle and pushing the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and everything was in its place. But there was no sign of his grandparents, no sign that anyone had been here in a long time. Jack's chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. What was happening? Where were they? He turned to leave, his mind racing, but then there it was again, that flicker of movement just at the edge of his vision. Jack spun around, his pulse quickening, but the room was empty. He stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the creeping sense of dread that had been building since he arrived refused to let go. Suddenly a noise, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable, came from downstairs. It was a sound that made Jack's blood run cold. A faint creak, like a door being slowly opened. He wasn't alone. Part 2. Seeking shelter. The rain was relentless now, sheets of water hammering down on Jack as he stood in the garden of his grandparents' house, staring helplessly at the locked door. His clothes were soaked through, sticking to his skin in the biting cold, and the wind howled with increasing ferocity. The darkness around him was suffocating, the village eerily quiet, as though the world itself had forgotten this place. Jack's heart pounded with a mix of frustration and dread. Where were his grandparents? Why was their house locked and abandoned like this? The question swirled in his mind, but he had no answers, only the unforgiving storm and the creeping unease gnawing at him. He wiped the rain from his eyes, squinting through the downpour as he looked down the road. He couldn't stand out here all night. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. The village was too small for a hotel, and the nearest inn was miles away, far beyond what he could walk in this weather. He could try knocking on the neighbors' doors, but the thought of bothering strangers at this hour, especially after seeing how deserted the village felt, seemed less and less ambiguous. Then, out of the murky depths of his memory, a name surfaced. Mrs. Thorne's house. Jack froze for a moment, the name sending a chill through him that had nothing to do with the rain. Mrs. Thorne had died years ago. He couldn't even remember when exactly. Her house had stood empty ever since, left to decay at the edge of the village like a forgotten tombstone. It had always been the subject of rumors when he was a child. The older kids in the village had whispered about it, stories of strange sounds, lights flickering in the windows at night, and figures moving in the shadows. They had dared one another to approach it, to peek through the broken windows or walk up to the rotting porch. But no one had ever gotten too close, not really. The house was bad news, they all knew that. But as Jack stood there, soaked and shivering, the idea of shelter outweighed his childhood fears. It was the only place nearby where he could wait out the storm. Superstition was for kids. He was a grown man now, and ghost stories weren't going to keep him from finding a dry place to rest. "Come on, Jack. It's just an old house," he muttered to himself, trying to inject some confidence into his trembling voice. His feet were already moving, slogging through the mud and puddles as he made his way toward the outskirts of the village. The walk to Mrs. Thorne's house felt longer than it should have, each step weighed down by the wind and rain. Jack's heart thudded louder in his chest the closer he got, a small part of him regretting the decision already. But it was too late to turn back now. He could see the silhouette of the house in the distance, looming like a shadow against the stormy sky. There it was. The house stood at the very end of the road, its 2 stories barely visible in the downpour. But the windows were dark, lifeless, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Weeds had overtaken the front yard, and the wooden fence that once surrounded the property had mostly rotted away, leaving only splintered posts sticking up like broken teeth. The whole place seemed to exhale decay, and Jack couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt in his mind. He hesitated for a moment, standing in the middle of the road as the rain beat down on him, staring up at the house. The wind howled it, whistling through the cracks in the walls, making the house almost seem alive. Jack could feel the weight of the legends he had heard as a child pressing down on him, each one replaying in his head like a cautionary tale. But what choice did he have? There was no going back. The storm wasn't going to let up any time soon, and he couldn't stand out here any longer. Taking a deep breath, Jack approached the front steps, the wooden boards creaking under his weight as he climbed the sagging porch. The door, warped and cracked from years of neglect, stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open with a slow, hesitant hand, the old wood groaning in protest. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rot and dust. Jack stepped into the foyer, the door creaking shut behind him with a loud, echoing thud that made him jump. The sudden silence inside was deafening after the roar of the storm outside. He stood there, just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The house was just as dilapidated as he had imagined, peeling wallpaper, cracked floorboards, and cobwebs clinging to every corner. The furniture that remained was covered in thick layers of dust, and the air felt heavy with years of abandonment. Jack rubbed his arms, trying to fight off the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. There was no fireplace, no central heating, nothing to provide warmth. The house was cold, colder than it should have been, colder than the storm outside. But at least he was out of the rain. He moved further into the house, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. His eyes scanned the shadowed rooms, taking in the sight of the abandoned furniture, the tattered curtains that hung limply from the windows, the layers of dust that seemed to coat everything. It felt wrong. It felt ... dead. Jack swallowed hard, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in his gut. It was just an old house, that's all it was. No ghosts, no spirits, no haunted memories, just wood and nails falling apart after years of neglect. He ventured into the living room, glancing around for a place to sit. The couch, once likely the centerpiece of the room, was now a sagging mess of springs and fabric, covered in dust and cobwebs. There were no family photos on the walls, no remnants of the life that had once filled this house. It was as though Mrs. Thorne had simply vanished, taking everything with her but the walls that now barely stood. Jack sighed, moving toward the staircase at the back of the house. If he was going to stay here for the night, he might as well find a place to lie down. Maybe one of the bedrooms upstairs would be in better condition, or at least less eerie than the decaying living room. The stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, each step sending a groan of protest through the house. The banister was loose, swaying slightly when he grabbed it, and the entire staircase felt like it might collapse at any moment. Jack gripped the railing tighter, his heart pounding with each creak, until he finally reached the second floor. The hallway stretched out in front of him, lined with closed doors that led to what he assumed were bedrooms. His footsteps were muffled by the threadbare carpet that ran down the center of the hall, and the air here felt even colder than downstairs, like the walls themselves were radiating a chill. He reached for the nearest door, turning the knob slowly. It opened with a soft click, revealing a small bedroom. The bed was still made, though the sheets were covered in dust. A wardrobe stood in the corner, its doors hanging open, revealing nothing but empty hangers. The curtains on the window were tattered, fluttering slightly in the draft that seemed to leak in from every crack in the house. Jack stepped into the room, glancing around. It was no luxury hotel, but it would do for the night. At least he was out of the storm. He set his backpack down on the floor, wiping the rain from his face with the sleeve of his jacket. His clothes were still damp, clinging to his skin, and the cold air inside the house wasn't helping. He needed to dry off, warm up, and get some rest. He peeled off his wet jacket, hanging it over the back of a dusty chair by the window, before sitting down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged beneath his weight, the springs groaning as if in pain. Jack rubbed his face, exhaustion beginning to settle in. The day had taken its toll between the long bus ride, the cold rain, and the eerie emptiness of the village. He felt drained, both physically and mentally. But despite his weariness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His mind kept drifting back to the stories he had heard as a child, the whispered warnings about Mrs. Thorne's house, the tale of strange figures moving in the windows at night, of flickering lights when no one was home, of doors that opened and closed on their own. Jack shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was just an old house, nothing more. The human mind had a way of making things seem scarier than they really were, especially in places like this. The wind, the creaking floors, the groaning walls, it was all natural. Nothing supernatural about it. But still ... why did the air feel so heavy? Why did the silence feel so loud? A soft creak from the hallway made Jack's heart skip a beat. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound had been faint, but unmistakable, a floorboard shifting, as though someone had stepped on it. He stared at the open door to the bedroom, his pulse quickening. For a long moment there was nothing. just the cold, heavy silence pressing down on him. And then another creak. Closer this time. Jack's blood turned to ice. Part 3. Uneasy Sleep. The room was deathly quiet, save for the soft rattle of the old window pane as the wind battered it relentlessly. Jack pulled the musty blanket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to seep through the very walls. The bed beneath him creaked and groaned with the weight of time, its frame shifting slightly with every breath he took. Exhaustion pulled at his eyelids, a heaviness creeping through his bones. Despite the unease that had been gnawing at him since he arrived, Jack knew he needed rest. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, and he had nowhere else to go. The old stories about Mrs. Thorne's house, the ones he had dismissed as childish superstition, drifted back into his mind, but he pushed them away. It was just an old house. There was nothing here but the wind, the rain, and the creaking bones of a forgotten structure. He closed his eyes, forcing his mind to settle. His body ached from the long journey, from trudging through the rain, from the cold that had latched onto him like a parasite. Sleep would come, he told himself. Sleep would chase away the fatigue, the chills, and maybe even the odd, lingering tension in his chest. But the house had other plans. Just as he began to drift into the comforting fog of sleep, a sound pierced the stillness. A faint noise, barely audible at first, but distinct. Jack's eyes snapped open, his heart skipping a beat. He lay still, straining to hear over the howling wind outside. It was there again, this time clearer, though muffled. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. But his mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, he reminded himself. Creaking floorboards, shifting wood, the wind forcing its way through cracks in the walls. There was nothing unusual about it. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing moment. Jack's pulse quickened. The dragging noise was coming from above, from the upper floor of the house. It moved at a steady pace, the scraping of something against the wood growing sharper, as though whatever it was drawing nearer. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the sound filling the room around him, curling into every corner, slipping under the door like a wisp of smoke. His breath caught in his throat as a cold shiver crawled up his spine. This was different. The natural groans of an old house were one thing, this was purposeful. It was deliberate. He sat up, the blanket slipping off his shoulders, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching toward him, as if the darkness itself was alive, aware. His eyes darted toward the ceiling, the space above him feeling impossibly close, as though the unseen presence on the second floor could crush down upon him at any moment. The dragging sound stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy, pressing against his ears. Jack held his breath, his body rigid as he waited, every nerve on high alert. The quiet stretched out, suffocating in its intensity, the house holding its breath with him. Then, without warning, the noise returned closer now, as if it had moved down the hallway directly above him. Jack's skin prickled with cold sweat, his hand clutching the edge of the mattress. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to breathe. Something was up there, moving through the house with a dreadful, lumbering intent. His mind raced. What was it? An animal. Maybe a stray that had found its way inside during the storm. But no, this wasn't the erratic movement of a frightened creature. This was something else. Something that knew exactly where it was going. His breath hitched as the sound grew louder again, dragging, scraping, each agonizing pull drawing it nearer. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears, his heart a wild drumbeat in his chest. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to see what it was. With trembling hands, Jack slid off the bed, his feet meeting the cold, hard floor with a soft thud. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to pull the covers over his head, like a frightened child, and wait for the noise to stop. But curiosity, or perhaps a deeper, more primal fear propelled him forward. He had to know what was making that sound. Slowly, as though every step might trigger something lurking in the shadows, Jack crossed the room. The floor creaked under his weight, echoing in the stillness, making him wince. His eyes were locked on the door, now a barrier between him and whatever waited beyond it. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The dragging sound stopped again, as if whatever was making it had sensed his hesitation, waiting for him to act. Jack inhaled deeply, summoning whatever courage he had left. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal knot, twisting it slowly, trying to keep the noise to a minimum. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. The sound resumed immediately, louder this time, as if the thing upstairs had heard the door open and was responding to it. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he stepped into the hall, his bare feet moving soundlessly across the threadbare carpet. His eyes were fixed on the staircase at the end of the corridor, the dark mouth of the upper floor looming like an entrance to another world. He took a step forward, then another. The noise above grew more urgent, the dragging now accompanied by a faint, wet sound, like something slick being pulled across the wood. Jack's stomach churned, his mind flashing with terrible images of what could be making such a sound. He reached the base of the stairs, the wooden banister trembling slightly beneath his hand. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward, the darkness at the top swallowing everything beyond the first few steps. Jack's legs felt weak, but something curiosity, fear, or sheer madness urged him to climb. The first step groaned under his weight, the sound reverberating through the house. He froze, his ears straining for any change in the noise above. The dragging sound stopped. Jack's breath came in short, sharp bursts, his throat tight. His eyes flicked toward the top of the stairs, expecting to see anything looming there. But the darkness remained impenetrable, silent. He took another step. The air grew colder as he ascended, each step feeling heavier, as though the very house was pushing against him, trying to keep him from reaching the top. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat, as he finally reached the landing. There, just beyond the doorway to the room directly above, where he had been resting, was the source of the sound. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat as he stared into the room. The dim light from the storm outside barely penetrated the gloom, but he could make out the shape of something lying in the center of the room. It was long, twisted, and covered in something dark and wet. The dragging sound resumed, this time accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thump, as though whatever it was now pulling itself toward him. Jack stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest as panic set in. He turned, his legs moving on instinct as he fled down the stairs, the noise behind him growing louder and faster. The walls seemed to close in around him, the house groaning with a life of its own as he stumbled into the hallway, then slammed the door shut behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the door, his hands trembling violently. The sound outside was deafening now, a relentless, wet scraping that seemed to be coming from all around him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Jack stood there, frozen, his heart racing, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But there was nothing, only silence, thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. He didn't dare move, he didn't dare breathe. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run, to leave this cursed place, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to make a sound. And then, just as he thought the silence would drive him mad, he heard it, a single, quiet creak coming from the other side of the door. Someone or something was standing there, waiting. Jack's blood turned to ice. Part 4. The Shadow Upstairs. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he stood at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. The house was silent again, but the memory of that dragging sound still echoed in his mind, as if the noise had wormed its way into his very bones. His heart raced, pounding so violently against his chest that he could feel the pulse in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, run, flee the house and never look back, but he couldn't. Something stronger than fear pulled at him, a dark curiosity gnawing at his insides. His hand trembled as he lit the stub of a candle he had found in the kitchen. The small flame flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It did little to push back the thick gloom that seemed to envelop the staircase ahead of him. He swallowed hard, gripping a piece of broken wood he had picked up, a pitiful attempt at arming himself against whatever was lurking upstairs. He took a shaky breath, steadying himself. He had to know what was up there. Each step felt like an eternity. The stairs groaned under his weight, the old wood protesting his every movement. The small flame flickered erratically, casting grotesque shapes on the walls, making them seem alive, writhing in the darkness. The air grew colder as he ascended, the chill biting at his skin, but it was more than just the temperature, it was the air itself. It felt thick, oppressive, like it was pushing down on him, trying to force him back. Halfway up, Jack paused, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His eyes were locked on the top of the stairs, where the shadows pooled like ink, thick and impenetrable. He strained his ears, listening for any hint of sound, but the house had fallen deathly silent once again. The absence of noise was somehow worse, as if the house was waiting, anticipating his every move. He reached the top of the stairs, his candle casting a small circle of light around him. Ahead of him, the hallway stretched out like a black void. The doors to the rooms on either side of him were closed, but it was the one at the very end of the hall that drew his gaze. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness leaking from it like poison, and then he saw it, a figure standing in the gloom, barely visible in the dim light of his candle. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She stood perfectly still, her back to him, her silhouette just barely outlined in the faint light. Her long, tangled hair spilled over her shoulders, hanging down in matted clumps. She was unnaturally still, so motionless that Jack wasn't even sure if she was real. His breath caught in his throat, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, didn't breathe. For a long moment, Jack just stood there, frozen in place, staring at the figure. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering candle, or was it something else, something worse? "Hello," Jack's voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. He didn't even recognize it as his own. His throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper, and his heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the words as they left his mouth. No response. The figure remained perfectly still, unmoving, unbreathing. Jack's grip on the piece of wood tightened, his knuckles turning white. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the figure at the end of the hall. The air around him felt thicker, colder, like he was wading through invisible water. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but his legs moved of their own accord. Another step, then another. The silence was unbearable, pressing in on him from all sides. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack's heart pounded in his ears, his pulse so fast that he felt dizzy. His candle flickered, the flame sputtering as if it too sensed the danger in the air. Closer now. The figure was only a few feet away. Jack could see the strands of her hair, filthy and wet, hanging limply down her back. She was wearing a tattered dress, the fabric clinging to her frame like a shroud. The air around her seemed colder, darker, as if the very shadows clung to her. He took one more step, holding his breath. And then she moved, not a lot, just the slightest shift of her weight, the barest tilt of her head, as if she had finally sensed his presence. Jack's stomach twisted in fear, a sharp pang of terror shooting through him. He took an involuntary step back, his candle flickering wildly in his shaking hand. Who are you?" Jack's voice broke, his words trembling as much as his body. The figure did not answer. She didn't turn to face him, but there was something in the air, something heavy, ominous. The feeling of being watched crept up Jack's spine, settling into his very bones. The figure at the end of the hall stood perfectly still once more, but now there was something different about her, something that sent a chill down Jack's spine. It was as if the air around her had shifted, the darkness swirling tighter around her figure. The silence was deafening. Jack felt his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, his skin crawling with fear. He wanted to turn and run, to flee down the stairs and out of the house, but he couldn't move. He was trapped, frozen in place by the sheer weight of the presence in front of him. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the figure began to turn. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if every muscle in her body was creaking with the effort. Jack's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. His fingers tightened around the piece of wood in his hand, his knuckles white with strain. As she turned, her hair fell away from her face, revealing pale skin stretched tightly over her skull, her eyes hidden in shadow. Her lips were cracked, dry, and her mouth hung open slightly, as if she was trying to speak but had forgotten how. Jack's breath came in short, shallow bursts, his entire body trembling. Every part of him screamed to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure as she completed her turn, now fully facing him. Her eyes dark, hollow voids locked onto his. A sharp, cold terror surged through Jack's body, his blood turning to ice. Her eyes were dead, empty, but they stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was as if she was looking straight through him, seeing something deeper, something darker. She took a step forward. Jack stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle in his panic. His back hit the wall behind him, the breath catching in his throat. The figure took another step, slow and deliberate, her feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor. Her lips parted slightly, and a low guttural sound escaped her throat, a rasping, wet noise that sent shivers down Jack's spine. He pressed himself harder against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest as the figure drew closer, her empty eyes locked onto his. Jack's breath came in short, panicked gasps, his hands trembling so violently that the candle flickered dangerously, threatening to go out. The figure was almost upon him now, her face twisted into something between a grimace and a smile, her mouth open wide, as if she was about to speak. But no words came. Jack couldn't take it anymore. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he pushed himself off the wall, his legs moving before his mind could catch up. He ran, his feet pounding against the floor as he fled down the hallway, his heart racing his chest. The candle blew out in the rush, plunging him into complete darkness. Behind him he heard it again, that dragging sound, slow and steady, following him down the hall. But he didn't dare look back. Part 5. The Haunting Revelation. Jack stood paralyzed at the end of the hallway, the flickering flame of his candle casting weak shadows that danced eerily along the cracked walls. His breath hitched as he called out again, his voice barely more than a croak, the words catching in his throat. "Who are you?" he whispered, though his voice trembled and faltered. The figure remained still, her back turned toward him, the long strands of her tangled, matted hair draped over her shoulders. She made no sound, no movement, just stood there, as if carved out of the very shadows that surrounded her. A shiver crawled up Jack's spine, a sensation of dread so palpable he could almost taste it in the air, thick like smoke. His feet felt as if they were rooted to the floor, heavy and unwilling to move. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat thudding in his chest, so loud it seemed to echo in the silence of the house. The candlelight wavered again, nearly extinguished by the trembling of his hand. Jack took a hesitant step forward, the old floorboards creaking under his weight, as though the house itself was warning him to stop, to turn back. But something, whether curiosity, fear, or sheer desperation, compelled him to move closer. "Please, just answer me," Jack muttered, his voice hollow in the vast stillness. And then she moved. It wasn't a gradual shift, not a slow turn of acknowledgement, but a violent, jerky motion, as if her entire body had been yanked by some unseen force. The suddenness of it nearly caused Jack to drop his candle. The figure's head snapped to the side with a sickening crack, and in that moment Jack felt his blood run cold. Her long hair parted slightly, revealing a sliver of her face, a gaunt, pale visage that looked more like a withered mask of skin stretched too tight over bone than anything human. Jack's heart seized in his chest. His muscles tensed, poised for flight, but he couldn't move. He was frozen, trapped in the terrible gaze of this figure. Slowly, agonizingly, she continued to turn, her head twisting further, her body lagging behind as though it resisted her movement. And then Jack saw her face. It was a face of nightmares, a hollow, deathly pale mask with sunken cheeks and skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Her eyes, if they could even be called that, were nothing more than dark, empty voids, black pits that seemed to suck in the dim light from the candle. But it was her mouth that drew Jack's horrified attention. Her lips were cracked and bloodless, her mouth gaping open wide, wider than humanly possible, a dark, yawning chasm of emptiness. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The air around Jack grew thick, suffocating, as if the very house was holding its breath in anticipation. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the ghastly figure before him, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All he could do was stare, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her arm. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, as though her body was being controlled by invisible strings. Her hand, pale and skeletal, rose slowly, her long, bony fingers extending one by one. She pointed directly at him. Jack felt his throat tighten, a choked gasp escaping his lips. A wave of cold terror surged through him, crashing over him like ice water. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to get away, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. His heart pounded so hard in his chest he thought it might burst. The figure's hand hung in the air, accusing, pointing. Her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, as if she was trying to scream, but no sound came. The silence was deafening, oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on Jack's chest. He could feel the blood draining from his face, his legs trembling beneath him. The cold sweat that covered his body made the air feel even more frigid. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps as his mind spiraled. What did she want? Why was she pointing at him? The question gnawed at him, terror clawing at his insides. He wanted to scream, but his voice had abandoned him, locked somewhere deep in his throat. The figure took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, but filled with a malicious intent that sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through Jack's veins. Her long, skeletal fingers remained pointed at him, her black eyes staring into his soul, seeing things he wasn't even aware of. She didn't blink, didn't waver, just moved closer, inch by terrifying inch. Jack took a shaky step back, his mind reeling with the horror of it all. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment, his entire body trembling uncontrollably. Well, he needed to run, needed to get away from this thing, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His muscles locked, his feet felt like they were made of lead. The figure stopped, her fingers still pointed at Jack's chest, her hollow eyes fixed on him. The silence between them stretched thick and suffocating until it was unbearable. And then she spoke. It wasn't a voice, at least not in the way that Jack understood voices. It was more like a rasping, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the house itself, echoing around him, wrapping itself around his mind like a vice. You ... The words were barely audible, but they hit Jack like a physical blow. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Took what? What was she accusing him of? He hadn't taken anything, he hadn't even been in the village for years. His breath quickened, panic setting in as the figure's empty eyes bored into him. Her mouth twisted, the gaping hole widening, as if she were about to scream. Jack's body reacted on instinct. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping the candle in his haste. The light flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, distorting the figure into something even more nightmarish. You ... I hear a voice. That horrible rasping voice grew louder, more insistent, as if she was pushing the words into Jack's mind, forcing him to listen. Jack's heart raced, his mind clouded with confusion and terror. He didn't understand. He hadn't taken anything. The figure's hand dropped, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, waiting for her next move, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. And then, with a sudden violent lurch, she rushed at him. The speed at which she moved was unnatural. One moment she was standing still, and the next she was inches from Jack, her hollow eyes inches from his, her mouth gaping open in a silent scream. Jack's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He stumbled backward, crashing into the wall behind him. The candle fell from his hand, plunging him into darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he backed away, his eyes wide with terror. What? The figure was gone, vanished into the shadows, but the sense of dread lingered, pressing down on him from all sides. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned and bolted down the hallway, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get out. His mind raced, every nerve in his body screaming in panic. But behind him, the dragging sound returned, louder now, echoing through the house like the steady beat of a drum. It was coming closer, chasing him, following him down the hallway. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he pushed himself harder, running faster, desperate to escape. But the sound followed, relentless. As Jack reached the stairs, he glanced back, just for a moment, and there she was, standing at the end of the hallway, her dark eyes gleaming in the shadows, her hand still pointed directly at him. You ... Her voice echoed in his mind, a haunting whisper that would follow him long after he escaped the house. Part 6. Desperate Escape. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears, the sound of his heart drowning out all other thoughts. The sight of the woman's hollow eyes and her deathly pale face still seared into his mind, but his body had already entered into survival mode. He spun around, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts, legs shaking beneath him as he raced toward the stairs. He didn't think he couldn't think. His only instinct was to run, but in his desperation, Jack's foot slipped on the edge of the top step. The sudden loss of balance was like the earth falling out from under him, and before he could even let out a scream, gravity took hold. He tumbled down the stairs, his body crashing hard against the wooden steps. each impact sending shockwaves of pain through him. Thud, thud, thud. Jack hit the floor at the base of the staircase with a final, painful slam. The air was knocked out of his lungs, and for a moment he lay there, dazed and disoriented. Every inch of his body screamed with agony, but the fear, oh, the sheer, overwhelming terror was far worse than the physical pain. His mind was clouded, spinning, but the sound brought him back to cold, brutal reality. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing across the wooden floorboards above him. The sound was so deliberate, so methodical, as if each step was carefully measured to draw out Jack's panic. His head jerked upward, his eyes wide with terror, but he couldn't see her, he didn't need to. He knew she was coming. Shakily, Jack scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain that coursed through his body. He winced as he put weight on his leg, but the rising fear inside him drowned out everything else. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She was descending the stairs now, her presence a dark shadow looming over him. The door. The front door was just a few feet away. Jack lunged for it, his hands trembling as they fumbled for the handle. The cold metal slipped under his damp fingers, his grip weak from fear. He twisted the knob with all his strength, pulling at it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic swelled in his chest like a rising tide, his breathing erratic. Come on, Jack muttered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling, his hands slick with sweat. The door didn't move, didn't give even an inch. His heart pounded harder, panic clawing at his throat, as the footsteps behind him grew heavier, more distinct. She was closer. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he yanked on the door with everything he had, his fingers clawing at the wood, nails scraping against the surface. The silence between the footsteps felt like an eternity, the anticipation unbearable. Then he heard it again, a step. Closer. No. A cold sweat broke out across Jack's forehead. His vision blurred, his body shaking violently as he continued to pull at the door, slamming his shoulder into it in desperation. Every nerve in his body was screaming, urging him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The footsteps stopped. Jack froze, his entire body rigid, paralyzed with dread. He didn't dare turn around, he didn't have to. He could feel her behind him, her cold, oppressive presence suffocating the air around him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Then came the whisper, soft, raspy and chilling. You took it. The sound was so close it felt as if the words were being whispered directly into Jack's ear, cold breath brushing against his skin. His entire body seized with fear. He could feel her standing right behind him, inches away. He could almost hear the faint rustle of her clothes as she reached out. No, Jack screamed, his voice breaking in sheer terror. With one final, desperate pull, the door flew open. Jack stumbled forward, his body lurching into the cold, biting rain outside. He hit the ground hard, the wet earth soaking through his clothes instantly. The rain came down in torrents, the wind howling through the trees, but the storm was a welcome relief compared to the suffocating dread inside that house. Jack scrambled to his feet, his body moving purely on instinct now. He slipped and slid in the mud, but he kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the rain pouring down over him. The darkness was thick, the storm swallowing him whole, but all he could think about was putting as much distance between himself and that cursed house as possible. Behind him, the door swung open with a loud creak, and for a brief heart-stopping moment, Jack thought he saw her, the figure, standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes staring out into the night, watching him flee. His heart raced faster, his legs burning with the effort to keep moving. The rain blinded him, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet, but Jack didn't stop. He couldn't. Every part of him screamed to keep running, to get as far away as possible. But even as he ran, a sinking realization gripped him. The woman's voice echoed in his mind over and over. You took it. What had he taken? What did she mean? The thought gnawed at him, even as he fled into the night. What had happened in that house? Why was she haunting him? He had never taken anything, never wronged anyone. And yet her words seemed so filled with malice, so full of accusation. The wind howled louder, the rain turning into a deafening roar around him. Jack's body ached with exhaustion, his soaked clothes clinging to his skin as he pushed through the storm. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but still he ran. Behind him, the house faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. But no matter how far Jack got, He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's hollow eyes were still watching him, following him. The darkness stretched on endlessly before him, the storm unrelenting. Jack's thoughts raced, his mind trying desperately to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers, only questions and the suffocating fear that it wasn't over. He glanced back once, just to be sure, his breath catching in his throat as he scanned the darkness behind him. The house was no longer visible, but the oppressive weight of its presence still lingered in the air. And then, through the roar of the storm, Jack heard it. The faintest whisper, "You took it." Jack's heart stopped. Somehow, despite the wind and rain, despite the distance he had put between himself and the house, he could still hear her. She was still there, watching, waiting, and she wasn't going to stop. Terror surged through Jack once more, and he stumbled forward, his legs buckling under him. The mud squelched beneath his feet, the rain beating down on him, but he forced himself to keep moving. The thought of stopping, of letting her catch up to him, was too unbearable. His chest heaved, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop, not now, because she was still out there, and she was coming for him. Part 7. Running in fear. Jack's lungs were burning, his heart hammering wildly against his chest, but he didn't dare stop. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to keep running, to not look back. But the rain was relentless, a cold, biting force that blurred his vision and soaked him to the bone. But the fear coursing through his veins was far worse than the storm that raged around him. His feet pounded against the slick, muddy path, slipping and sliding with every desperate step. The village blurred past him, houses looming like dark, twisted shapes in the rain. Each one seemed to hold shadows, lurking figures just waiting to reach out and pull him back into the nightmare he was fleeing. Jack barely noticed them. All he could think of was the woman, hollow, dead eyes, her gaunt face twisted in that silent scream. She was behind him. He knew it. He could feel her presence, feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, urging him to look back. But he didn't. He couldn't. The thought of seeing her again, even just a glimpse, filled him with a terror so paralyzing, it almost stopped him in his tracks. Almost. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning his throat as he pushed himself to keep going. The rain lashed at him, sharp and unforgiving, but it couldn't numb the fear that had taken hold of his mind. His soaked clothes clung to him, heavy and cumbersome, but he didn't care. Jack's legs felt like they were on fire, muscles screaming in protest, but still, he ran. He had to escape, he had to get away. Somewhere behind him, over the howling wind and the pounding rain, Jack thought he could hear her slow, deliberate footsteps following him. The sound was faint, barely there, but it was enough to send another surge of panic through him. Was she gaining on him? Was she getting closer? The thought made his heart lurch painfully in his chest, and he nearly stumbled in his frantic flight. The darkness of the village swallowed him whole. The narrow streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning like a maze designed to trap him. The rain made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but Jack didn't care. He wasn't thinking about where he was going, only that he had to run, had to get as far away as possible. Every breath was a battle, every step a struggle, but the fear kept pushing him forward. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of terror and confusion. How could this be happening? What was she? A ghost? A hallucination? Some part of his rational mind screamed that none of this was real, that it couldn't be. But the cold, the rain, the pain in his legs and lungs, they were all too real. And so was the dread that hung over him like a shroud, suffocating him with every passing second. Jack's mind raced as he pushed through the storm. He needed to find a way out. He needed to escape this nightmare. But the village, the familiar streets he had once known, now felt foreign and hostile. Every shadow seemed to reach out for him, every corner a potential trap. It was as if the entire village was conspiring against him, bending to the will of the entity that pursued him. And still, those footsteps echoed in his mind, slow, deliberate, relentless. Jack's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. His lungs burned, his throat raw from the cold air and the exertion. His entire body ached with exhaustion. But the fear kept him moving. It was all that kept him going. The woman's face, those dark, empty eyes flashed in his mind, and a shudder ran through him. He could still see her, standing at the top of the stairs, her bony finger pointing directly at him, as if marking him for something far worse than death. Ahead, the village began to thin out, the houses giving way to open fields. The outskirts. Jack had made it to the edge of the village, but he couldn't stop, not yet. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the ground beneath him turning into a thick, slippery mess of mud. Jack's feet slid with every step, but he forced himself to keep running, his body operating on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. Behind him, the village disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness. The wind howled through the trees, bending them almost to the point of breaking. The rain, freezing and unrelenting, pelted down on him, soaking him to the bone. Jack's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed onto the muddy ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching from the strain of his desperate escape. The cold mud seeped into his clothes, chilling him to the core, but he didn't care. He had made it. He was out of the village. He was safe, wasn't he? Jack lay there for what felt like an eternity, his heart still racing, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, each one a painful reminder of how close he had come to what? Death? Something worse? His hands clenched into fists, digging into the wet earth as he tried to calm himself, but the fear wouldn't leave. It clung to him like the rain, cold and suffocating. Slowly, painfully, Jack pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin. His hair was plastered to his forehead, rainwater dripping into his eyes, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the woman, the way she had pointed at him, the emptiness in her eyes, the silent scream that seemed to echo in his mind even now. He had to get up, he had to keep moving, but his body refused to cooperate. Jack's limbs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by the terror that still coursed through him. The rain continued to pour down, the storm showing no sign of letting up. It pounded against him, driving him deeper into the mud, but Jack barely noticed. His mind was too consumed by the horror of what he had just experienced. He had to get away from the village, away from her. But as Jack staggered to his feet, a new wave of dread washed over him. Something was wrong. The air around him felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him from all sides. The rain, which had been cold and biting just moments ago, now felt suffocating, like a wet blanket smothering him. Jack's breath hitched in his throat, his chest tightening as a sense of dread settled over him. He wasn't alone. Slowly, hesitantly, Jack turned his head, his heart hammering in his chest. The darkness behind him seemed to shift, the shadows moving with a life of their own. And then, through the sheets of rain, he saw a figure, standing at the edge of the village, barely visible through the storm. It was her. The woman. She stood motionless, her dark, hollow eyes locked on him, even from a distance. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his entire body seizing with fear. She hadn't stopped. She was still following him. His legs moved before his mind could register the command, and Jack stumbled forward, his body screaming in protest as he forced himself to keep running. The fear was suffocating, overwhelming, but he had no choice. He couldn't stop. Not now, not when she was still coming for him. The rain blurred everything around him, but Jack didn't care. He didn't need to see, he just needed to run. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burning with every breath, but he couldn't stop. Not while she was behind him. The darkness swallowed him whole, the storm raging around him, but all Jack could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, loud, frantic and terrified. And behind it, just barely audible over the roar of the storm, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps following him into the night. Part 8. The morning after. The morning light was weak and pale, struggling to break through the thick mist that clung to the village like a shroud. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world drenched in cold, wet silence. As the fog swirled around the deserted streets, villagers began their day, unaware that something or someone was waiting near the bus stop, trembling in fear. Jack sat hunched on the ground, his clothes soaked, his body shivering violently. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, staring blankly ahead, as if he could still see the horrors from the night before playing out in front of him. His pale skin seemed almost translucent in the morning light, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps, as though each one was a painful effort. It was the village baker who saw him first on his way to open the shop. He stopped in his tracks when he noticed the strange figure by the bus stop slumped, drenched and barely moving. At first he thought it was just another traveler who had gotten caught in the storm, but as he stepped closer, he recognized the man. "Jack," the baker called out, his voice unsure. Jack didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. Concern growing in his chest, the baker hurried over. Jack's appearance sent a chill down his spine. There was something wrong. Something very wrong. His lips were blue, his hands shaking uncontrollably, as if the cold had seeped deep into his bones, but it wasn't the cold that terrified him. It was something else, something far worse. Jack the baker tried again, kneeling beside him. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Slowly, as if hearing the voice from a great distance, Jack blinked. His head turned slightly, his hollow eyes meeting the baker's, but there was no recognition, no spark of life behind them. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. His throat was dry, his voice almost a whisper when he finally spoke. The house Jack's voice was hoarse, barely audible, but the terror in it was unmistakable. "It wasn't empty," the baker frowned, confused. "What house? What are you talking about?" But Jack wasn't listening. He wasn't really there. His mind was still trapped in the house, still locked in the nightmare he had barely escaped from. His hands twitched, gripping the muddy ground beneath him, as if trying to ground himself in the present, but his body remained tense, ready to flee at the slightest sound. His eyes darted around, scanning the foggy streets, as if expecting someone to come for him again. By now, a small crowd had gathered, villagers curious about the commotion. Whispers spread quickly someone had found Jack near the bus stop, and he looked as though he'd seen a ghost. People exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations turning to the storm, the strange noises they thought they'd heard in the night. "The house wasn't empty," Jack repeated, his voice trembling, as if the very words were enough to drag him back into that hellish place. His entire body convulsed with the memory of her, the woman who had stood in the darkness, pointing at him with that long bony finger, her hollow eyes filled with a hatred so deep it seemed to reach across the veil between life and death. "Which house?" Jack, one of the older villagers, asked, stepping forward. His face was weathered and stern, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Jack's breath hitched, and for a moment he seemed to falter, as if he didn't want to say it, didn't want to relive it. But then, with a ragged exhale, he whispered, "Mrs. Thorne's house." The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew the story of Mrs. Thorne, the old woman who had died in that decrepit house years ago, leaving it to rot at the edge of the village. Some said her spirit still lingered, unable to move on, while others dismissed it as mere village superstition. But now, seeing Jack, seeing the terror that gripped him, they weren't so sure. "You didn't go in there, did you?" another villager asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking of the house aloud might summon something dark. Jack gave a barely perceptible nod, his eyes unfocused, staring through the mist as if he could still see the shadows moving within those decaying walls. "I had no choice," he rasped. "The storm. The rain. I thought it was just a story." He trailed off, his voice breaking, as if the weight of his own words were too much to bear. He hugged himself tightly, rocking slightly as though trying to comfort himself, but nothing could erase the horror that had clawed its way into his soul that night. "The door wouldn't open," Jack continued, his voice shaking. "I tried, but it wouldn't open. And then she was there." Upstairs a murmur rippled through the crowd. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, some of them taking a step back, as though even being near Jack might invite the same fate that had befallen him. "She was there," Jack repeated, his voice growing more frantic. "Standing in the hallway, her back to me. I called out. I thought maybe it was someone, but when she turned, his voice cracked, and his breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, his eyes wide with terror. She wasn't human," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Her face, those eyes, those empty, black eyes." Jack's words hung in the air like a death sentence, filling the villagers with a cold, creeping dread. No one spoke, no one moved. They had heard stories, of course, about the house and the things that supposedly happened there. But this was different. Jack's haunted expression, the way his body trembled uncontrollably, it was undeniable. Something terrible had happened. The old villager who had spoken earlier cleared his throat, trying to break the oppressive silence. "You were just scared," Jackie said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It was dark. You were tired. Your mind know. Jack's sudden outburst startled everyone. He scrambled to his feet, his body shaking violently as he stood, swaying as though he might collapse at any moment. It wasn't my mind, she was real. She was there. His eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting her to appear again at any second. She's still there. In that house the villagers stared at him, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty. They wanted to believe it was all in his head, that he had imagined it, but the terror in Jack's eyes, the raw, visceral fear, it was too real to ignore. Slowly, cautiously, the old man stepped forward again. What did she want? Jackie asked softly. What did she say? Jack's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the old man, his eyes wide and hollow, as though he were trying to find the words but couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered. She didn't say anything. The crowd remained silent, hanging on his every word. She just pointed. Jack continued, his voice trembling. She pointed at me, like she was marking me. A collective shiver ran through the villagers. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts couldn't shake the chill that crept down their spines at Jack's words. The fog seemed to thicken around them, the air growing colder, as if the very mention of the house had stirred something malevolent. Jack's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground once more, his body racked with sobs. I thought I was going to die, he whispered. I thought she was going to take me with her. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. The weight of Jack's story hung over them like a dark cloud, and for the first time in years they wondered if perhaps the stories of Mrs. Thorne's house weren't just tales to scare children after all. Perhaps something still lingered in that house waiting, and now it had its eyes on Jack. Part 9. The house remains haunted. In the days that followed Jack's harrowing escape, a thick cloud of fear settled over the village. The whisper spread like wildfire, stories of what Jack had seen, what he had encountered in the abandoned house. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, recounting Jack's pale, trembling form near the bus stop, his wild eyes, his frantic words about Mrs. Thorne's house. It didn't take long before the village's already cautious inhabitants decided to steer clear of the cursed place altogether. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the house had always been an ominous presence. It loomed at the edge of the village, tucked away like a malignant tumor, festering with time. Overgrown vines clung to its decaying walls, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of years of neglect. Even the wind seemed to howl differently when it blew past the crumbling structure, as if it too carried the echoes of the house's dark past. Jack's experience, his haunted expression, had solidified what many had suspected but were too afraid to confront. Mrs. Thorne's house was more than just an old ruin. It was something else, something much worse. As the story of Jack's encounter spread, the villagers began to treat the house like a cursed entity, avoiding it at all costs. No children played near it anymore, not even the bravest of the boys who used to dare each other to throw rocks at its broken windows. The house became a ghost itself, forgotten yet ever present, lurking in the periphery of the village's collective consciousness. For years, Mrs. Thorne's house had been a source of eerie legends. Everyone knew the tales how the old woman had lived there alone, estranged from the rest of the village, a recluse after the untimely deaths of her husband and daughter. Rumors had swirled about her practicing strange rituals, about her descent into madness. And then there was the night of her death, how the villagers had found her, cold and lifeless, her face twisted in a grotesque mask of fear, her body lying in a pool of blood. It was said that her spirit never left the house, that she lingered, angry, vengeful, bound to the place where she had met such a tragic end. Now, with Jack's terrifying experience fresh in their minds, the villagers no longer treated those stories as mere superstition. They spoke of Mrs. Thorne's spirit as a real and palpable threat. Jack had seen her hollow eyes, her twisted face, her accusatory finger pointing directly at him. The very thought of it sent chills down the spines of those who heard the tale. Jack's retelling had left no room for doubt. Something unnatural had taken hold of that house, something that was still waiting. Days turned into weeks, and the house stood untouched, rotting away in the overgrown landscape. No one dared to approach it, not even out of morbid curiosity. The bravest souls in the village, the ones who had previously scoffed at the idea of ghosts, now stayed silent. They had seen Jack, heard the terror in his voice, and felt the chill that came with the mere mention of the house. They knew better than to tempt fate. Life in the village resumed, but it was different now. There was a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement. No one ventured near the house, not even during the day. Its shadow loomed larger than ever before, its dark windows like empty eyes watching, waiting. Even animals seemed to avoid the area, as if they too sensed the malevolent presence that lingered within. Dogs that wandered too close would whimper and retreat, their tails between their legs, and birds that once nested in the eaves had long since abandoned the place. At night, the villagers would sometimes catch a glimpse of the house in the moonlight, and they would shudder. In the distance, it appeared almost alive, the shifting shadows playing tricks on the eye. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows, faint and ghostly, though none dared to investigate. Others swore they heard sounds, soft whispers carried on the wind, or the creak of floorboards as if someone or something was moving inside. The most superstitious of the villagers believed it was Mrs. Thorne herself, still pacing the halls of her home, still searching for something or someone to claim. The village elders, those who had lived long enough to remember Mrs. Thorne in her final years, spoke of the house in dire tones. They warned the younger generation to stay away, to respect the dead, especially those who had not passed peacefully. There are some things, they would say, their voices low and serious, that are better left undisturbed, and so the house remained. Year after year, season after season, it continued to rot, its structure slowly collapsing in on itself. The roof sagged, the walls crumbled, but still it stood unmoving, unyielding, as if it were waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. The village too moved on, but the fear never fully dissipated. The legend of Mrs. Thorne's house became a permanent fixture in the town's lore, passed down from one generation to the next, growing more chilling with each retelling. Jack, meanwhile, never returned to the village. He left the day after his ordeal, boarding the first bus out of town without so much as a glance back. His haunted eyes and pale complexion had left a lasting impression on the villagers, who spoke of him often in the years that followed. Some said he had been driven mad by what he had seen, that he was never the same after that night. Others speculated that he had moved far away, trying to escape the nightmares that surely plagued him. But there were whispers, quiet, unnerving whispers, that maybe Jack hadn't escaped after all. Maybe Mrs. Thorne had marked him just as he had feared. From time to time, travelers passing through the village would ask about the house, drawn by the stories they had heard. The villagers, ever wary, would shake their heads and offer vague explanations. "It's just an old, abandoned place," they would say, their eyes betraying the fear they still carried. "Nothing to see there." But those who knew the truth, the ones who had lived through Jack's ordeal and seen the look in his eyes, understood that the house was far from empty. It remained a cursed place, a dark spot on the village's history, its malevolent presence ever watchful. And so it stood decaying and forgotten, but never truly abandoned. At night, when the wind howled and the moonlight cast long shadows over the village, the villagers would lie in their beds, listening. Sometimes, if the night was especially quiet, they swore they could hear it the faintest sound, like a door creaking open, or the distant echo of footsteps on rotting floorboards. Mrs. Thorne's house, it seemed, was still very much alive. It waited.